Thank you for joining us. We're on location in Temple Kolami Emmanuel in Plantation, Florida, for a special Solidarity with Israel event. The need to promote Israel is greater than ever with all the condemnation worldwide, and speaking today is Consul General Chaim Shacham. We'll hear his views on these challenges following these messages.
Finally, the US is beginning to realize it. The ISIS threat has made its way to their own cities. In Washington, the administration instructed the US Army and Marines to launch strikes at selected ISIS objectives, including its chiefs in Syria and Iraq. This has likely prompted a series of tweets consisting of threats on Washington and Chicago residents that we already hear inside the US, inside your cities and streets. The FBI is taking no chances and has ordered local police forces to be vigilant. The planned attacks on ISIS, for the first time also now in Syrian territory, was underscored by the recent release of the ISIS video clip showing the brutal execution of photojournalist James Foley, coupled with the concerns that additional American and British citizens have been captured by ISIS. The military options currently under discussion in both the US and Europe are arming rebel groups fighting ISIS and assisting them, limited cooperation with Assad's army, and removing ISIS chiefs using means, tools and methods akin to the ones applied by the US in Iraq and Pakistan. So who and what is ISIS, or ISIL? This is an acronym for Islamic State of Iraq and Syria Levant, a radical Sunni extremist terrorist splinter group of Al-Qaeda operating in both Syria and Iraq. Since 2003, ISIS's current leader and military chief is Mohammed Abu Bakr, who assumed command after his predecessor, Abu Ayyub al-Masri, was killed in an American bombing. Under Abu Bakr's leadership, ISIS has invested enormous efforts in conquering vast areas in Syria and Iraq, where the organization wants to establish a form of radical extremist Sunni Islamic rule. In Iraq, ISIS currently holds much of Mosul, parts of Tikrit and Sinjar, and it is fighting for control of the important Mosul water dam, while suffering heavy casualties from US fighter jets. ISIS consists of militants from multiple nations, many of whom have UK and other European passports, a source of concern upon their return to their respective countries, in particular the UK. In addition, ISIS compromises many Chechen and Turkish fighters. Apart from President Obama, the only leader in the West who has called for real action against ISIS has been Laurent Fabius. The French Minister of Foreign Affairs advocated the disruption of the organization's funding, which is estimated at billions of US dollars. These funds come from multiple donors from the Middle East, primarily from Qatar. Among the forces fighting ISIS is the Yazidi minority, which is considered part of the Kurdish nation. The Yazidi fighters received funding and supplies from several Arab countries, but ISIS beat them back and conducted a comprehensive genocide. Since fighting began, ISIS militants have reportedly murdered thousands of Yazidis, including women and children, some of whom have been buried alive. It has been reported that 300 Yazidi women were abducted to serve as slaves, servicing ISIS fighters. The fighting drove about 40,000 Yazidis to flee their homes and become refugees.
There is no Israeli siege on Gaza. Israel allows in all the food and medicine that Gaza wants. In fact, everything can go in except weapons and items that can be used to make weapons. In the last 2 years, 78,201 trucks imported via Israel's border 1.7 million tons of merchandise. In fact, 14,328 people crossed the border in May, 31% patients and escorts who receive world-class medical treatment in Israel, 30% businessmen, 10% internationals, such as journalists, aid workers, and anti-Israeli activists. But recently, an entirely new path into Israel has been opened up. Terror tunnels, used by dozens of Hamas terrorists to attack civilians on Israeli soil. With neighbors like Hamas, would you give up control over your border?
With us now is Consul General Chaim Shacham. A pleasure and privilege to have you on the show, sir.
My pleasure.
We're witnessing dramatic times in history, and the need to promote Israel, diplomacy, Israel's image, hasbara in Hebrew, has to be more critically important than ever. What are your thoughts on that?
We have a very challenging situation. We have enemies that will sink to any level in order to make Israel look bad. And we have seen in the latest Gaza operation an enemy that is willing to sacrifice hundreds, if not thousands, of its own civilians just in order to make Israel look bad. It has placed its civilians in harm's way, used them as human shields, because according to the calculations of the Hamas, the terrorist organization in Gaza, if these civilians as human shields protect them from Israeli attack, then that's good. But if they are hurt in an Israeli attack against them, that's even better. So when any civilian is hurt, for Israel it's a tragedy, but for the Hamas it's a victory. That presents us with a very big challenge in the court of public opinion, that in a civilized world, such an evil strategy as used by the Hamas is just not comprehended.
Atrociously insane. What a tragedy. How is Israel addressing this media war situation where the world press is feeding the masses basically false information, lies by omission?
Well, the way that Israel has to address this, there's no magic bullet, and we have to work on a number of different paths. But first of all, prepare the information. And we have gotten better at documenting how it is we carry out our military operations and demonstrating how Hamas or whatever terrorist organization we are having to counter uses the civilian population to mask its own terrorism. And we have documented proof of about 500 different instances in which schools or hospitals or homes are used as launching pads for rockets or as bunkers for headquarters. We are also working very hard in order to get that information out, if not through the mainstream media, through the alternate forms of media. Gone are the days where everyone's opinion of the world is taken from the evening news. Now people can get their news from alternate news sources and share it with other people. And we are working very hard in order to package our message, not just for conventional media, but also for social media.
Israel is criticized for not having a more effective media and PR effort.
Actually, if you would ask our adversaries, they feel that we have a very good media effort. Before I came here to be Consul General, worked in the Foreign Ministry as the Director of Information and Internet. And we would have foreign ministries throughout the world come to us in order to learn how it's done. So although we, as pro-Israel advocates, are very sensitive when we see Israel bashing on the media, we should know that we do a very good job with the resources that we have.
Let's discuss that a little bit more. The bashing of Israel, the tendency for the world, the media, to single Israel out for criticism while closing their eyes to often worse events that occur elsewhere. This one-sided criticism of Israel is a form of anti-Semitism. What are your thoughts on that?
I wouldn't go that far with everyone. There are a number of reasons why this happens. First of all is the technical reason. Although every major news organization has a correspondent to the Middle East, most of them are based in Israel. And because they are sent by a news organization, they have to produce news. So a lot of that news has to do with Israel. They can't cover what's going on in Iran or Iraq or in Syria because it's too dangerous. And even in Egypt, it's very difficult to get good reporting. So it's like looking for the coin underneath the lamppost. That's how the media is more concentrated, even over-concentrated, with a magnifying glass on what's going on in Israel than anywhere else in the Middle East. The second reason is we have to understand that although theoretically or historically the media has always been a vanguard of truth and has always arrayed itself to balance out the power of government, which is the historical role of a free press, you have then an anti-establishment bias in media to begin with. But also media needs to turn a profit. And because media needs to turn a profit, it will tend to be sensationalist. And because in the Middle East, if one seeks to have the income of a very wealthy Arab world in cable subscriptions or the like, then it's important to have a message that can be palatable in the Arab world, which is not going to be a pro-Israel message. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have those that no matter what Israel does, it will be criticized. And that already is bordering on anti-Semitism, yes.
It's hard to imagine that anyone really benefits from these wars, but what more can Israel really do? Israel gave Gaza back. There are those who argue that Gaza and the West Bank are part of Israel. Certainly the Arab world has more land than the United States. Do they really need Israel? But anyway, giving Gaza to the Palestinians, that didn't work.
Unfortunately, there is a split in the Palestinian people. One side, the Palestinian Authority, has declared that it intends to solve its confrontation with Israel through political means, hopefully through negotiations, while the other side, led by Hamas, does not recognize Israel, has declared its intent to destroy Israel and its desire to do so through armed struggle, which is a euphemism for terrorism. So that's one problem that we have, that although we would like to negotiate, and we do have ostensibly a Palestinian partner, they are not in control of the entire Palestinian people at this time. However, we do feel, and this has been the position of the Israeli government for the past 4 or 5 years, that the best solution to the Palestinian aspect of the Arab-Israeli conflict is the creation of 2 nation states, the nation state of the Jewish people, which is Israel, and a Palestinian nation state. We just have to do that through negotiations because the issues that we have to discuss, the 5 core issues, which are where will the border be, what will security arrangements be, what will be the disposition of Israelis on the other side of the border, known as the settlement question, what will be the disposition of the refugees. There are Palestinian refugees as well as Jewish refugees that came out of Arab countries in 1948 because of the creation of the State of Israel. And the most difficult of the 5 is what will be with Jerusalem. So we have a very difficult a negotiation ahead of us with that part of the Palestinians who want to negotiate. And then we have this bloc that rules Gaza that doesn't even consider negotiation an option.
Well, they claim that their desire and intent is to wipe Israel off the map. Difficult to have a dialogue with the people in that position.
Absolutely. We can't speak with someone about how they intend to destroy us. That's not a negotiation. That's ludicrous. So the only way to confront them is to make sure that no threat emanates from the territory that they control to Israeli civilians.
I remember that wonderful day in history when Anwar Sadat came to Israel, spoke at the Knesset, and what an inspiring moment in history that was.
Yes, it was.
What are the possibilities that we'll see more such inspiring opportunities?
Unfortunately, because of the changes that are taking place in the Arab world now, we are very unlikely to see, at least in the foreseeable future, the ceremonies of signing peace treaties and doves being released and balloons going into the air, because the Middle East today is not the same Middle East as it was then, because of the rejection of the Arab street of the nation-state concept in the Arab world, and of the strengthening, because of the strengthening of the theologic element in Arab regimes. Any accommodation or understanding with Israel will be below the radar and probably ad hoc alliances. So we will hopefully reach an agreement on issues such as how to deal with Assad with some states, and in other states we will have differences of opinions, while some states will agree with us on Iran, and in other states we'll have differences of opinion. There will probably be ad hoc alliances rather than grandiose peace treaties.
I'm thinking about another subject altogether, which is that of the incredible achievements of the State of Israel, from the early days of Yafa oranges to the high-tech situation that we are so proud of today. Share with our audience some of the positives, the achievements of the State of Israel.
Well, they are so many that I'm sure you don't have enough time in your broadcast, but just to pick a few, perhaps you've heard that per capita there are more Nobel Prize winners in Israel than any other state in the world, and per capita there are more university degrees in Israel than any other state in the world. There are more books published in Israel than any other state in the world per capita, more startups than any other state, and the list goes on and on. It's an amazing, amazing country, both culturally and politically and economically. We've been able to achieve things with one hand tied behind our back because we've been living under an Arab boycott, an economic boycott, and of course a state of almost siege by our neighbors since our establishment in 1948, and we've been able to achieve things that no other state has ever achieved. So this is, yes, it is miraculous, and I'm very proud to be able to represent a state like Israel.
And with good reason. In fact, Israel's neighbors would benefit so enormously if they would all recognize Israel's right to exist. What are the prospects for anything like that to occur, to have more peace in the Middle East?
It will take time, especially now that we're still waiting for the dust to settle after what was heralded as the Arab Spring, but what is turning out to be a Muslim winter. And we'll have to see where, you know, the dust settles and what the landscape is going to look like after this earthquake. Hopefully there will at least be a return to the basic tenets of civilization, where the idea of cutting off your enemy's head is not going to be acceptable to the regimes in the region. And we'll just have to wait and see and do the best we can until the situation clears up.
Bezrat Hashem, Consul General, a real pleasure and honor to have you with us today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I'll be right back. We now continue with a special report from Israel.
En période de calme, c'est 3 missiles qui tombent par semaine. Des amis qui vont travailler dans les champs et en un coup il y a des snipers qui leur tirent dessus. Tu peux pas t'habituer à avoir constamment une menace de mort sur toi. Tu apprends à vivre avec, tu apprends à gérer ce stress. Il y en a qui pleurent. Il y en a qui prient, c'est vraiment chacun sa façon, mais je pense que personne ne prend ça à la légère. Il faut savoir qu'avant qu'une opération commence ici, chez nous, c'est toujours 2-3 semaines avant, c'est chaud, c'est très très chaud, c'est des tirs constants. La maison représente vraiment le symbole de la sécurité, c'est chez moi, je suis en sécurité, tout d'un coup, ton chez toi n'est plus en sécurité. Et tu n'as plus de lieu sûr où lequel tu peux te reposer et être tranquille. Il y a un stress qui s'accumule, une peur qui s'installe. Et cette fois-ci, à la différence des autres fois, c'est qu'il y avait les khadirot, les tunnels. Et les tunnels, ça a instauré un sentiment de peur que les missiles n'ont encore jamais installé.
בחדשות. פלסטינים ירו יותר מ-80 רקטות לעבר ישראל. בקיבוץ באשכול נפצע אב שניסה להגן על בנו וילדי גן נוספים מפגיעת רקטה.
הוא הצליח להחזיק...
Le matin, je me lève, je vais déposer mon fils à l'école. Je devais revenir à 10h avec ma femme pour justement faire la fête à l'école pour mon fils. Et on voit qu'il joue dans la cour. Tout d'un coup, on entend la tseva adom. Alors là, on a l'habitude. Ma femme court prendre mon fils et se met directement à l'abri dans le GAN. Tout d'un coup, on entend un gros boom. Je sais que ça, c'est pas un Kassam, c'est un patsmar qui tombe. J'aide les gardiennes à entrer les enfants dans l'école. Et je vois qu'ils sont tous dans une pièce sur laquelle il y a 2 fenêtres ouvertes. Et c'est là que je leur dis, bon allez, faut bouger là, faut bouger, faut venir plus, faut s'éloigner des fenêtres. Pendant que je vous dis ça, il y a des tirs qui continuent à tomber, hein. Les patsmars, les mortiers qui tombent, c'est pas juste un boom, c'est tout le sol qui tremble. Tu trembles avec, c'est intense. Ma femme, elle, craque. Elle prend notre enfant dans ses bras, elle se met dos contre au mur. Et là on pleure, les pattes marines continuent à tomber, avec Tseva Adam, et c'est vraiment intense. Je me mets au-dessus d'eux et je les protège, en espérant que ça passe. Et c'est pas passé. Le 4e patsmar apparemment a explosé vraiment juste à côté du GAN, et c'est là que moi j'ai reçu l'éclat. Un éclat d'obus. À partir du moment où j'ai vu que ma femme et mon fils étaient sains et saufs et que les autres enfants étaient plus ou moins à l'abri, loin des fenêtres, j'ai commencé à me regarder moi. J'ai vu qu'il y avait une belle grosse flaque de sang là, j'ai commencé à toucher pour voir d'où l'hémorragie sortait. Et après, l'infirmier du kibbutz est venu, m'a fait un bandage pour bloquer l'hémorragie, et puis on m'a emmené dans l'ambulance. J'ai donné un bisou à mon fils et j'ai dit à ma femme, t'inquiète pas, ça va aller, tout ira bien. Vraiment une seconde après, j'ai reçu l'éclat. Je me suis dit, merde, j'espère que c'est pas la dernière fois, quoi. J'espère que c'était pas la dernière chose que je leur dirais, et que mon fils pourra grandir avec moi, et que je pourrai le voir, et que je pourrai continuer. C'est à ça que j'ai pensé, pour être honnête. Le lendemain de ce qui s'est passé chez nous, à Niroz, c'est exactement la même chose. Daniel, Zichrono Bracha, il est mort. Ça aurait pu être la même chose pour mon fils. On ne peut pas savoir ce genre de choses. Lui, moi j'ai été chanceux, ou la famille de Daniel, elle n'a pas été chanceuse. C'est ça c'est le quotidien, c'est notre quotidien, ça. Les mortiers qui tombent. Une petite erreur, on ne fait pas attention, la fenêtre est encore un peu ouverte, et le prix à payer est impensable. Je ne pouvais pas m'empêcher de penser à Eshed, mon fils, qui lui, que moi j'ai pu protéger. Le petit Daniel, personne n'a pu le protéger. Ils étaient 3, 2 parents, 3 enfants. Ils ont fait tout ce qu'ils ont pu pour essayer de protéger leurs enfants, et c'est ce qui s'est passé. Je suis désolé, j'en tremble un peu, mais... C'est pas facile, c'est pas facile. Il faut vraiment que les gens prennent conscience que les gens qui habitent dans Otefaza ont une menace constante, que ce soit à travers les tunnels, que ce soit à travers les tiftoufim. Ces tiftoufim, ça tue, ça ne peut plus tourner, quoi. Faut que ça s'arrête. Moi, c'est mon fils et ma femme qui me donnent la pêche. C'est eux qui me donnent envie maintenant de me lever et de continuer pour eux. On est 6 millions j'avais une famille de 6 millions de personnes ici, donc bon, quand je vois qu'il y a des gens qui ont appelé ma femme, qui ne nous connaissent pas, ni d'Adam ni de Ève, qui nous disent tout ce que vous voulez, faites-nous savoir, on vous aidera, venez chez nous, il n'y a pas de problème. C'est ça Israël. C'est ici notre destin, c'est ici notre maison. C'est ici qu'on peut vraiment être nous-mêmes. Et c'est pour ça que je reste.
This concludes our special program for today from On Location in Plantation, Florida. I'm Richard Peritz. Thank you for being with us.